Thank you for joining me as I conclude my examination of Natasha Crain's book, Keeping Your Kids on God's Side from My Atheist Perspective. In this, the final video of this series, we will cover the final 5 chapters of the book. Those would be chapters 36 through 40. So let's get started with chapter 36. What is Old Earth Creationism? Crain opens the chapter with an anecdote about cooking steak. And she reveals that she likes her steak well done. And that's the seemingly irrelevant detail that brings the rest of this book into focus for me. Of course, she likes her steak well done. No offense to anyone watching who also prefers well done steak. It's nothing personal. You're just wrong, and you should be ashamed. Anyway, her husband bought a digital meat thermometer, so he would know when her steaks were ruined. I mean, when they were well done, when her steaks were well done. But this one time, he served her a steak that the thermometer read as being hot enough in the middle to be well done, but when she cut into it, it was rare. And as Natasha Crain sees it, there were only 3 possibilities to account for this occurrence. Either the thermometer was wrong and the steak was actually rare, or the thermometer was correct but her husband was using it wrong. Perhaps he had inserted it into a different part of the steak than he should have, so it gave a misleading reading. Or the thermometer was right, and the steak was actually well done. She says, quote, "In a way, the disagreement between young Earth and old Earth creationism is like this steak debate. The thermometer is like the Bible, and the steak is like the Earth. Both young Earth and old Earth creationists agree that the thermometer, the Bible, is not in error, but they disagree on whether you can use it in more than one way." The problem is that the Bible is being used as a thermometer to see how well done the Earth steak is at all. The Bible is many things, but a thermometer to tell how well done a metaphorical steak representing Earth is not one of them. Radiometric dating, now that's a meat thermometer for Earth steak that you can set your watch by. What does the watch represent? I have no idea. I didn't think that through. Crain announces that in this chapter we will look at 3 points old Earth creationists use to support their view that the conclusions of modern science regarding the age of Earth are basically correct. First point is that the most obvious reading of some Bible passages is not necessarily the correct reading. Young Earth creationists insist that Genesis clearly refers to literal 24-hour days in the creation story, but that might not be what the passage was trying to tell us. Some biblical passages that appear to have fairly straightforward literal meanings obviously are meant to be telling us something else. For example, there is the passage Matthew 16:28. And in discussing this, Crain cites the work of author and supreme leader of the First Order, David Snoke. Crain notes, according to Snoke, that in Matthew 16:28, Jesus says that the people listening to him speak will still be alive when Jesus returns in his kingdom, which is usually interpreted as when Jesus returns on Judgment Day to judge the world and to usher in the new heaven and the new earth. Jesus says that there were some here who will not have passed away when that happens. But that can't be what Jesus actually meant, because here we are 2,000 years later, all of the people of Jesus' generation are dead, but he hasn't returned yet. So this verse must obviously mean something else. Perhaps it's not referring to the second coming of Christ, but to the resurrection or the transfiguration. Or maybe it's a prediction that Jesus made that turned out to be completely wrong, and Christians should just admit that. And I'm not one to insist that the Bible must be read literally at all times. I respect differing interpretations. I often say that there is no one objectively correct way to read a book, particularly a holy book, because believers interpret holy books not only in terms of what they mean, but also in terms of what requirements the holy book is placing on them, what it's telling them to do. And then there are also issues of translation and cultural context to consider. So I'm very open and comfortable with the fact that Christians interpret the Bible in many different ways. But as long as you refuse to allow for the possibility that the Bible is just plain wrong about something. You're not really being honest in forming your interpretation. Is it possible that the literal reading of a passage isn't the intended meaning and that it's actually meant to be taken some other way? Sure, of course that's possible. And in many cases that may in fact be the case. Maybe Jesus was talking about the resurrection or the transfiguration or the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem or some other thing. Or maybe he was talking about his second coming and he promised it would happen before the then current generation passed away, and then that's not what happened. That's a possibility as well, but that's a possibility that Christians who interpret the Bible differently but always keep that centerpiece of it's the Word of God and what it says has to be true in place, they completely disregard that possibility. But if you're not going to allow for the possibility that maybe the Bible just says something that turned out to not be true, you're not really being honest about your interpretation. Old Earth creationists respect science at least enough that they aren't willing to just ignore it in order to keep believing the Bible is true. But that belief in the truth of the Bible is so dogmatic that apparently nothing will ever persuade them that something in the Bible is not true. And that is not science. Old Earth creationists, Crain writes, tend to fall into two categories. Those who hold to the day-age theory, which states that the individual creation days described in Genesis are essentially accurate, but they don't represent literal 24-hour days, but rather long periods of time where the events described as taking place on that day took place. And then there are also Old Earth creationists who hold to framework theory, which regards the Genesis creation story as poetic and in no sense an actual chronology of history. They view it as just a general framework in which the creation of the world is meant to be understood, but it's not a literal account in any sense. Second point, a closer reading of the text indicates that a literal reading of Genesis is not the originally intended interpretation. For instance, Genesis says that the sun was not created until the fourth day. But the phrasing, the evening and the morning were the whatever day, appears before that. That means the days of creation referred to in Genesis could not be literal 24-hour days because those did not happen on earth before the existence of the sun. Therefore, they must be referring to the beginning and ending of creative periods, and the terms evening and morning are figurative. I'd also like to point out that not only was there no night and day on earth prior to the sun, there was no earth prior to the sun. The Genesis account depicts earth as being created before the sun, and that is absolutely 100% scientifically inaccurate. It's all just poetic and not meant to be taken literally in any sense. Reading of the framework theorists appears to be the only salvageable interpretation, assuming you're committed to the Bible is the inerrant Word of God thing, which again, you don't have to be, and you really shouldn't be committed to it to that lengths if you're willing to say, well, yeah, okay, the Bible, Genesis does say evening and morning before the creation of the sun. Certainly seems like the people who wrote the Bible were lacking a fairly basic understanding of what night and day actually were and how important the earth's relationship to the sun is in defining those periods of time. But we can't say that the people who wrote the Bible were wrong because we believe the Bible is perfect and the inerrant Word of God, so we have to come up with a more creative interpretation. I don't think that is an honest way of proceeding. Anyway, third point. There is no theological difficulty in accepting that death occurred before the existence of humans. Young Earth creationists believe that all death is a result of the fall of Adam. Old Earth creationists say that the fall of Adam introduced death to humans only. Death clearly already existed because when God warns Adam not to eat of the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, he tells them, when you eat of the fruit, you will surely die. And how would Adam know what God was talking about if death didn't already exist? Also, when God created the beasts of the earth on the sixth day of creation, the word used to describe them in Hebrew is chaya, which usually refers to carnivorous animals. If carnivores existed, so did death. because killing and eating other animals is what carnivores do. Crain ends the chapter by emphasizing that both young Earth and old Earth creationists are concerned for the Gospels, and they each believe that their interpretations are not in conflict with Christianity or with the message of salvation brought by Jesus. And while they disagree on quite a bit, both young and old Earth creationists do at least agree on one point, that humans were created specially by God and are not the products of an evolutionary process. So lest you think that old Earth creationists are too reasonable when it comes to science, they might go with you on the age of Earth, but they're not willing to let go of humans being products of special creation. So let's talk about evolution in the next chapter, chapter 37. What is evolution? A Christian apologist explaining what evolution is. This is always entertaining. So evolution in its most basic sense means that species undergo genetic change over time. This isn't controversial at all, Crain says, but the theory of evolution proposes that these genetic changes not only occur within species, but also create new species, and that's where the controversy comes in. Not if you understand evolution. There is no controversy within the scientific community over this issue. The controversy is manufactured by people who don't understand evolution or who don't want others to understand it because they view it as a threat to their version of their faith. Well, Crain mentions microevolution and macroevolution. Micro is variation within a species. Macro is large-scale changes above the species level. But she does make sure to note that biologists don't generally use these terms, because microevolution and macroevolution are the exact same process. Now, Natasha Crain doesn't say that they are the exact same process, but that's why biologists tend not to prefer those terms, because there is no difference except one of scale between microevolution and macroevolution. It's the same process. So, how does evolution work, allegedly? Well, to put it simply, by which I mean to summarize Crain's already highly summarized description, random mutations sometimes occur when DNA is copied. Most of these mutations have no significant effect on the organism at all. Sometimes these mutations are harmful, but sometimes these mutations actually allow the organism to function better in its environment than it would have without the mutation. This advantage allows that organism to survive and to produce more offspring than other organisms that it competes with for resources in its environment. And that has the effect of producing more of these organisms that have that mutation in the next generation. As this process continues and advantageous mutations continue to accumulate through many, many, many generations, eventually those organisms will be so different from their ancestors that they will constitute a new species. In this way, all life on Earth evolved from a single original life form that first appeared billions of years ago, probably about 4 billion years ago, according to most current estimates. And Crain cites the Galapagos finches as an example of evolution that has been observed and studied. But creationists would argue that the Galapagos finches are examples of microevolution, not macroevolution. So what is the evidence for macroevolution? Again, assuming that they are distinct processes, which they aren't, but let's just go with it. The evidence for macroevolution is presented in the next chapter, which is chapter 38. What are the major pieces of evidence for evolution? Crain begins this chapter by describing how her own faith was badly shaken when she learned about evolution. Having not encountered it in school, she was 30 by the time she began studying it in an online course produced by BioLogos, the group founded by Francis Collins that teaches that science and Christianity are compatible by promoting a form of theistic evolution. Crain says that she devoured 8 lessons in a single day and then turned away from her computer feeling numb. She recognized that the case for evolution was strong, and she wondered why she shouldn't accept it, since she had no problem with accepting other branches of science. She wasn't sure how her faith could be reconciled with the evidence for evolution. She writes that it was devastating well, then she probably should have kept going with those biologos lessons, because I'm pretty sure reconciling Christianity with evolution is the whole point of that organization. But anyway, evolution, Crain says, is one of the major reasons why young people are turning away from Christianity. If her lifetime of faith, because remember, she was 30 when she first learned about evolution, and if her lifetime of faith could be so badly shaken by the evidence for evolution, what hope does the inexperienced, uninformed, innocent faith of a child or a teenager have? Parents need to know the evidence for evolution so they can be prepared. Prepared for what? Prepared to distort their children's understanding of science in order to maintain a religious faith rooted in ignorance and falsehood. Gotcha. Arguably, the most important source of evidence for evolution is the fossil record. Simply put, the fossil record confirms many of the predictions made by the theory of evolution. It shows life on Earth progressing from simple to more complex organisms, and it contains transitional forms at the expected places in the timeline. Crain emphasizes that the fossil record being exactly what we would expect to see according to the theory of evolution doesn't mean that evolution is definitely true, but it is one of the strongest pieces of evidence in favor of it. And I have to give credit where credit is due. I made a little crack at the beginning of the previous chapter about how it's always fun to see apologists attempt to describe evolution. She actually does a fair job going through the evidence for evolution, describing what evolution is. She describes the fossil record fairly and reasonably, and she acknowledges that it is very strong evidence for the theory of evolution, and she encourages her readers to go beyond her book and to do their own research. So good for her. More evidence for evolution is found in the geographical distribution of species, also known as biogeography. Through biogeography, we can see evidence of convergent evolution, which occurs when organisms that exist in similar environments but in different parts of the world, so the organisms that live there aren't closely related to each other. They evolved independently, but because they live in similar environments, they have adapted to the conditions of those environments in similar ways. And the example that Crain uses is succulent plants, which have thick, fleshy leaves or stems that they can store water in. And these succulents are often found in environments where there isn't a lot of rainfall, which is their way of adapting to that low rainfall environment where there isn't a whole lot of water. They develop a way to store their own water. And that shows that different plants have independently adapted to similar conditions in basically the same way. And that's a good piece of evidence for evolution. That's exactly what evolution would predict, that the evolution of organisms would be shaped by natural selection within their environment. The distribution of species on islands is another aspect of biogeography that provides evidence for evolution. Species on islands in the ocean that were never connected to the mainland tend to be descended from species that are found on the nearest continent or large landmass. Oceanic islands also tend to have less biodiversity because animals living there are descendants of animals from the mainland that were able to travel to the island. And not all species living on the mainland would have been able to travel to the island in order to colonize it and reproduce and leave descendants. Continental islands, on the other hand, which were connected by land to larger continents at one time, tend to have a wider array of species because they have the same types of species that you find on the mainland because they used to be directly connected to the mainland, and it was easier for animals from the mainland to migrate to what is now the island. Yet more evidence for evolution is found in the form of vestigial traits. These are organs or other parts of animals that were useful to ancestors of the modern animals, but which have now lost their usefulness. For example, ostriches can't fly, but they still have wings. In a similar but distinct category from vestigial traits, there is the occasional appearance of what are called atavisms. Atavisms are traits that belong to an ancestral species, but that sometimes will spontaneously reappear in particular individuals of a modern species descended from that ancestor. This happens because sometimes when traits are lost to evolution, they remain in the genetic code in the form of inactive genes. And every once in a while, for one reason or another, a mutation or some other reason, these genes are activated in particular individuals, and the ancestral trait will reassert itself. Examples of this include humans born with vestigial tails, which is incredibly rare but has happened quite a few times throughout medical history. Horses born with extra toes, whales born with hind legs. These mutations do occur, and these are called atavistic traits. And I would also add that vestigial traits and atavisms are two examples of observed and firmly established phenomena that make no sense outside of an evolutionary context. Unless you're going to propose that original sin is the reason why some animals, including humans, are occasionally born with seemingly random traits like tails or legs that shouldn't be there. There's also the existence of pseudogenes. These are non-functional DNA sequences that may once have coded for traits, but which are now merely genetic leftovers. They're inactive. The example cited is the GLO gene. GLO produces an enzyme that allows the body to produce its own vitamin C. Primates, which means us, humans are primates, don't make their own vitamin C, and we have to get it through our diet. But primates do have a pseudogene that matches GLO, which means we have within our genetic code the ability to make our own vitamin C, but it has been deactivated due to a mutation. So that's some of the evidence for evolution, summarized but fairly presented, I think. But as Crain says, there are two sides to every story. But that doesn't mean both sides are necessarily true. Case in point, chapter 39. What are the major challenges to evolution? Some Christians see no conflict between their faith and the fact of evolution, but some Christians have a big problem with it. And those Christians are the ones Natasha Crain is writing for, apparently. In this chapter, she promises to look at some of the biggest scientific challenges to evolution. There are two challenges to the evidence from the fossil record. First, the relative lack of transitional fossils. While transitional forms are there, as Crain acknowledged in the previous chapter, some skeptics of evolution, that's Crain's term, not mine, question why there aren't more transitional forms. More transitional forms, the argument goes, would make the fossil record less open to interpretation. As it is, there is room to debate where a given fossil's proper place is in the history of life. And the accusation of creationists is, well, if you believe that evolution is true, then of course you interpret the fossil record in light of that, and you make the fossil record seem like it reinforces your theory. Crain also quotes intelligent design proponent William Dembski, who argues that while there are transitional forms in the fossil record, there are no forms documenting the transition from one form to another fundamentally different form. And he uses the example of, in the fossil record, you can see a good record of, say, the evolution of the horse. But all of the forms in that line are horses. They're familiar as types of horses. And he says, where's the transitional forms between radically different forms? And the problem with Dembski's argument is that those changes from one fundamental form to another, for example, from invertebrates to vertebrates, or say insects and vertebrate animals evolving from common ancestors, those sort of radical breaks in the evolutionary tree where two very different organisms end up evolving from a common ancestor. Those sorts of changes take a long, long time, even by evolutionary standards. You wouldn't expect to see the gap between invertebrates and vertebrates bridged in one transitional form. The divergence of those two lines would take a long time. And the same thing for evolution of insects and vertebrate animals. And in fact, that branching off took place so long ago that the common ancestor probably has very little superficially in common with either insects or vertebrate animals. So you might not even necessarily recognize it as a transitional form between those two, or a bridge between those two. That's why we don't expect to see those major changes close up in the fossil record. But if we zoom out and we look at long-term trends in the record, changes that take millions of years to work themselves out, that's exactly what we do see. We do see that overall transition from simpler organisms to more complex organisms, and we do see those branches forming in the tree of life. You just can't see them if you zoom in super close and you're looking at individual forms, because those changes are far too large scale to be perceived in that way. Now, the next challenge to the fossil record is questioning the Cambrian explosion. Creationists, I'm not going to call them evolution skeptics, I'm just not, argue that the Cambrian explosion, during which life on Earth became significantly more complex and varied in a relatively short period of time, around 40 million years or so, can't be explained by evolution. For one thing, why are Precambrian organisms found in fossils so different from Cambrian fossils? For another, why has evolution remained so relatively stable since the Cambrian explosion? For yet another, how did the DNA of organisms suddenly get so much more complex during the Cambrian explosion? Well, these are all good questions, but I'd like to point out that none of them are challenges to evolution. There aren't that many Precambrian fossils available to us to examine to begin with, because Precambrian organisms were mostly tiny and soft-bodied, and they lived a long time ago. The Cambrian explosion is thought to have occurred over 500 million years ago. So any fossils that do survive of organisms from that epoch are buried very, very deep in the ground. They're very hard to find, and we're incredibly fortunate to have the Precambrian fossil record that we have, sparse and incomplete though it may be. As for how evolution was able to move so quickly during the explosion and why it has seemingly settled down since then, those aren't questions that throw the occurrence of evolution into doubt. We may not know what caused the Cambrian explosion or what caused the rate of evolution to slow down when it ended, but the fossil record indicates clearly that those things did happen. Neither of those things renders evolution an untenable theory. They're just aspects of the history of life on Earth that we don't fully understand yet. And by the way, there are biologists who question the Cambrian explosion, or at least the mainstream view of it. There are biologists who argue that the Cambrian explosion wasn't as dramatic as it's typically seen to be, that organisms which we consider Cambrian forms existed long before the era of the explosion. Again, this isn't a challenge to evolution. This is a challenge to our understanding of the history of the evolution of life. Next, challenges to the DNA evidence. First, there isn't as much junk DNA as we would expect. And second, most DNA mutations are harmful or neutral. Again, neither of these are serious challenges to the fact that evolution occurred and is occurring. Recent studies have found that there is far less non-functional DNA, in the human genome than was once thought. That's not a point against evolution. That's a point in favor of increasing our understanding of evolution and genetics. If a creationist wants to count the smaller than expected amount of junk DNA as a failed prediction of evolutionary theory, that's fine. No one ever said that the theory was perfect or that every prediction based on it would turn out to be true. If you want to prove that evolution is not a valid theory, however, you still have to contend with all of the predictions based on it that have come true and find other ways, better ways of explaining those. The harmful or neutral mutations objection is barely even worth mentioning. I learned in my first year biology course in college that most mutations are neutral. This is not information that is being hidden from people about evolution. And this is one reason why significant changes take so long to manifest in evolution, because not only are mutations relatively rare, beneficial mutations are rarer still. Next, there is a challenge to natural selection, which creationists say can explain changes within species, but can't explain speciation, which is the emergence of a new distinct species from another one. Well, here's the problem with this whole way of thinking. There isn't an electrified fence erected around the perimeter of a species. The concept of a species is something we came up with so that we could categorize organisms and be able to talk about them and compare them and better understand them. There is no barrier preventing the descendants of, say, a rabbit from ever being anything other than a rabbit, no matter how far into the future you go. Mutations produce changes. Over many generations, these changes accumulate. Eventually, that accumulation of changes results in animals different enough from their ancestors that we categorize them as being a unique species. It's a marvelous, wondrous process, but it's not magic. There's no chasm to jump to go from one species to another. It doesn't work that way. This is an argument from incredulity. Finally, there is a challenge to the origin of life. Where did life come from to begin with? And to her credit, Crain does acknowledge that the origin of life is not strictly speaking of concern to the theory of evolution. The theory of evolution describes what happened to life after it originated, how we wound up with the variety and diversity of life that we see on Earth today. She does, however, question the notion that life emerged from non-living matter. Personally, the longer that I study evolution, and I am by no means an expert or even a serious student of the subject, though I have learned a great deal about it at the layperson's level in researching responses to apologists over the years, the more I believe that this is yet another argument from incredulity, and that there is in fact no insurmountable barrier between living and non-living matter, just as there is no such barrier between species of organisms in evolution. We invest a lot of mystical power in life. We romanticize it, we put it up on a pedestal, and it's incredible. Life is a beautiful, amazing thing. But at the bottom of everything, at the biochemical level, life is just matter that does things that non-living matter doesn't do. Life is a process. And when that process ends, life ends. It's a simple way of saying it, but that's the difference between the animate and the inanimate. Crain, speaking for creationists, questions how life can emerge from non-living matter. But if you think about it, life emerges from non-living matter all the time. Every moment of the lives of every living thing is an example of life emerging from non-living matter. We refer to nucleic acids and proteins, carbohydrates and lipids as biological molecules, but that's just because they are present in biological organisms. There's nothing magical about them. They have certain properties that enable them to perform important functions in living things. But those properties in and of themselves are no more or less important or extraordinary than the properties of other molecules. When you demystify your thinking on the subject and recognize life as just something that results when certain types of molecules get together and interact with each other, this question of where life came from becomes a lot less daunting. It's still fascinating, and it's still a question I really hope we get a good answer to someday, preferably during my lifetime, because I'd love to know. And life itself is a wonderful thing that should be cherished and honored and respected. But it's not magic. It's not divine. It's just one of many ways of existing in the universe. Let's move on now to the final chapter of the book, chapter 40, What is Intelligent Design? So, if those are all the arguments against evolution, and if evolution isn't the explanation for how life on Earth got to be the way it is, what is the explanation? How about intelligent design? Intelligent design, Crain tells us, is the theory that some features of the universe and of living things are too complex to have resulted from natural processes. They must have been designed by some intelligent agent. She writes, quote, "Before we move on, however, it's important to clarify that the theory of intelligent design has no religious commitments. It doesn't attempt to identify or describe the intelligent cause that might be responsible for any scientifically detected design. The conclusion of design is strictly based on an inference from data. That doesn't mean there are no theological implications, of course. If scientific evidence of intelligent design can be discovered, that's clearly consistent with the possibility that God might be the designer. Intentionally or not, that's one of the most inaccurate and misleading statements in this entire book. While it's true that intelligent design has no explicit religious commitments and that ID advocates don't necessarily identify the intelligent cause as any particular deity, that vagueness is, pardon me, by design. To say that intelligent design has no religious commitments is to completely ignore how and why the intelligent design movement was created. Intelligent design is reformatted Christian creationism. There's no other right way to say it. The first advocates of intelligent design in the 1980s and 90s were creationists, like Stephen Meyer and Charles Thaxton. Intelligent design was introduced in response to the U.S. Supreme Court ruling in 1987 that creationism could not be taught in public school science classes because it violated the separation of church and state. Intelligent design deliberately avoids specifying who or what the intelligent designer is, but that is only in an effort to sneak creationism under the guise of intelligent design into science classrooms without technically violating the Establishment Clause. All major advocates of intelligent design are creationists. All major organizations that promote intelligent design are religious in nature, including the Discovery Institute, which claims it's a secular think tank but is actually secular in name only. And, oh, by the way, in 2005, in the case of Kitzmiller versus Dover Area School District, the U.S. District Court for the Middle District of Pennsylvania ruled that intelligent design could not be taught in public school science classes because it, quote, cannot uncouple itself from its creationist and thus religious antecedents. Intelligent design is Christian creationism by another name, period. And by arguing otherwise, Natasha Crain, unwittingly or not, is carrying water for dishonest creationists who are attempting to fool people into thinking that intelligent design is some completely different thing. It's not. It's creationism. Now let's learn all about it. Intelligent design, Crain says, is all about detecting design in nature. Intelligent design proponents acknowledge that biologists consider nature to have the appearance of design. However, they contend that certain aspects of nature are so complex that they must have actually been designed. In order to differentiate the appearance of design from supposed actual design, intelligent design proponents look for what they call specified complexity. There are 3 criteria that must be met for something to qualify as an example of specified complexity. It must be contingent, complex, and specified. So 2 of the 3 criteria for specified complexity are that something has to be complex and specified. Sounds totally legitimate and not at all like something somebody just made up to sound scientific, doesn't it? Okay, so contingent in this context means that the object doesn't have its design because of a natural event. For example, Crain says, ice crystals are very intricate, highly ordered structures that appear to be designed, but they only look that way because of the way crystals naturally grow. They are necessarily in that form. Therefore, they aren't contingent. Therefore, they aren't designed. Complex in this context means that the object is so intricate and highly structured that it's improbable that it formed by chance or through natural forces. And specified means that the object exhibits a meaningful pattern. DNA meets all 3 of these criteria and is therefore considered by ID advocates to be an example of specified complexity. Well, here's the problem. DNA is complex, and DNA does behave according to a predictable pattern. So if you accept this contingent, complex, specified set of criteria, it hits 2 out of the 3. But I don't see how DNA qualifies as contingent. Crain argues that DNA is contingent because it functions like a computer code. And a computer code works the way it does, not because it has to work that way, but because it is the product of an intelligent mind and was designed for a particular purpose. But DNA isn't a computer code, and actually, it doesn't really function like a computer code or like a language, except perhaps on a very superficial level. We use terms like code or language to refer to DNA because those are useful metaphors, but ultimately DNA is a collection of molecules. And what DNA does, how those molecules combine and interact with each other and with other types of molecules, is determined by the physical properties of those molecules. If ice crystals don't qualify as contingent because they're just doing what they naturally do, then DNA isn't contingent either, because it's just doing what it naturally does. And the fact that DNA serves an important purpose in biological organisms doesn't suggest that it must have been designed. Lots of things in nature serve specific purposes depending on your point of view. The stars in the night sky served a vital purpose to travelers in the days before GPS technology by allowing them to navigate with reference to the stars. That doesn't mean the stars were put there by design. Crain wraps up her look at intelligent design with this, quote, "Intelligent design theory has been the target of attacks from all sides. Evolutionists regularly reject it as illegitimate science. Some theistic evolutionists express skepticism that God's supernatural activity in the world would be scientifically detectable. Other Christians criticize intelligent design proponents for not going to the next level of making a case for the biblical God. For these reasons, the idea and value of intelligent design theory have remained controversial, despite its potentially exciting contributions to the conversation of faith and science. Intelligent design is creationism by another name. But even if we pretend that it isn't, it still has a fundamental flaw that keeps it from deserving recognition as a science, and that flaw is it has no explanatory power. It has even less explanatory power than traditional upfront creationism, in fact, because it deliberately avoids identifying the designer who supposedly created all these contingent, complex, specified things. Intelligent design proponents are essentially pointing at things like DNA, which they have determined are too complex to have been produced by nature, and declaring somebody designed it. Who designed? How? By what technique? For what purpose? Who knows? This has no more explanatory power than declaring it was magic. It was designed. It was magic what done it. They're exactly the same thing. Intelligent design offers no explanations of how the design was accomplished or by what. Intelligent design makes no predictions that allow us to test it as we observe nature. It is in no sense a scientific theory. It is in no sense a scientific anything. If you study evolutionary theory, you'll learn all sorts of fascinating things about how evolution works, about different kinds of speciation, about how natural selection has shaped the development of species across countless generations. You'll even encounter biologists arguing with each other over how important natural selection is to shaping species, because some think it's incredibly important, others think it's not as important as all that. There's a lot of disagreement on that. You'll learn about the evidence that establishes that all life on Earth is descended from common ancestors. You'll learn about various competing models for how evolution works that have been proposed over the years, like, for instance, punctuated equilibrium, which proposes that evolutionary change tends to happen in short bursts, or gradualism, which proposes that evolution tends to proceed at a fairly steady, continuous pace. If you study intelligent design, you'll get a lot of protracted arguments from incredulity and a lot of very purposeful evasion of the subject of who or what the designer supposedly is. It's not science. It's religion masquerading as science, and it's not a very convincing costume. Well, that's it for the final chapter. Now, Crain ends the book with a brief section titled 10 Tips for Having Deeper Faith Conversations with Your Kids. Most of it is fairly standard Christian parenting boilerplate. Study the Bible with your kids, try to understand why your kids are struggling with their faith, etc. But there are 2 suggestions in this list of 10 that are actually very good suggestions. I'm not a parent, but I think these 2 suggestions are excellent. Whether you're a Christian trying to raise a child in your faith or anything else, any other kind of parent. The first good suggestion is emphasize critical thinking skills. Crain is using the phrase critical thinking as a code word for rationalizing Christianity in the face of contradictory evidence. She even says that critical thinking is important so that kids will be able to recognize challenges to their faith as propaganda. Assuming that your position is the correct one from the beginning and treating all contrary arguments as propaganda is not critical thinking. So instead of doing that, I would recommend teaching your kids to use actual critical thinking, to think for themselves, and to be willing to pursue the truth wherever the evidence takes them. Teach them to be critical, to be skeptical, to not settle for the easy answer or the answer that makes them feel the best or the answer that requires the least amount of effort on their part. Teach them to question authority, but also teach them to recognize genuine expertise. Teach them to not let their reasoning be guided by their personal preference for one conclusion over another. And teach them not to become dogmatically attached to their conclusion once they reach it. What seems like the right answer now might look different in a few years when they encounter new evidence or a better argument. Teach them to be open to re-examining their beliefs. And teach them that a skeptic should be most skeptical of themselves. Not just their conscious beliefs, but their biases, their blind spots, their implicit assumptions. Skepticism isn't something that should only be directed outward at other people or other groups. Self-reflection is important. And the other good suggestion is to teach your kids about religions and worldviews other than Christianity. Not so they can make a note of all the ways in which Christianity is different and therefore better, but so they can come to appreciate the breadth and variety of religion and the important role it plays in human cultures. Teach them to recognize when religion is used as an excuse to justify prejudice and intolerance and other abuses, but also teach them to recognize when religion functions as a way of calling people to something higher, to be charitable, to be compassionate, to be vigilant against injustice and inequality. In other words, teach them to recognize how people use religion, how people use religion as an excuse to be better people, how people use religion as an excuse to keep right on being the shitty people that they were to begin with. Teach them to notice what various world religions have in common with each other in their myths, in their rituals, and also to notice the differences that the various different religious traditions attempt to impart meaning and purpose to life. Teach them to read the Bible, the Quran, the Bhagavad Gita, the Avesta, the Tipitaka, and other religious texts, and appreciate them for their literary value and for the insights they provide into the history and culture of the people who wrote them. The Bible in particular is a very rewarding and endlessly fascinating book, and the King James Bible especially ought to be of interest to anyone who studies English literature or who wants to be a writer in English. But all that interesting stuff, all that complexity is crushed out of it when we flatten the Bible and teach it as the perfect Word of God, and we instruct people to view it as that and only that, and to interpret it in light of that dogmatic conclusion. This is the Word of God. Everything in here is true. And the same goes for other religious scriptures. Study them. Seek to understand them as what they are, which are products of human imagination, creativity, guile, ambition, deceit. They're human products, and they reflect humanity in all of our greatness, all of our glory, and all of our avarice and our greed and our ambition and our fear and our ignorance. This has been, without exaggeration, one of the most frustrating books I've ever reviewed in this format. It's ping-ponged wildly between standard apologetics, horrifyingly frank acceptance of biblically condoned slavery and rape, and the occasional reasonable point. I don't think it's a very good parenting book because, questionable content aside, it reads like a book written for adults with a few tossed-off reminders that this stuff is important for your kids. The topics addressed in the book aren't presented any differently than they've been in the nearly 24 other apologetics books I've reviewed in the past. The book isn't tailored to parents in any way. Problems aren't presented in ways that parents could take and translate into a conversation with their kids. It's literally just an apologetics book for adults with the occasional mention that it's meant for parents. It's like a cheesy WWF wrestler from the 90s with a gimmick related to a particular occupation, like a wrestling race car driver or a wrestling dentist or a wrestling plumber. All actual 90s WWF gimmicks, by the way. But once you get past the superficial costume, you realize that there's really nothing special or different about them. They're not a wrestling dentist. They're just a regular wrestler dressed like a dentist. Keeping your kids on God's side isn't a parenting book. It's an apologetics book dressed up like a parenting book. And it's not even a very good apologetics book. Then again, what is? That's it, folks. That's it for this Atheist Read series. And that's it for the Atheist Read series in general for this year. As is my custom, I'm going to take the rest of the year off. This spot in my upload schedule on Thursday, when these videos typically go up, will be filled by Steve and Stuffy videos, which those of you who watch my content generally know are my favorite videos that I do. They're like my children. I love making them and being part of them, and I would love for you to watch them next Thursday and for every Thursday for the rest of the year. If it's not something that you have typically checked out, give it a chance, because I love my Steve and Stuffy videos. They're a radical departure from this. They're more like little comedy skits with some occasional political commentary and hopefully some pathos and something to get involved with and something to care about. But I love making them. They're my favorite things that I do, and they will be taking the spot of the Atheist Read series for the rest of the year. And then in January 2018, I will be coming back to do more Atheist Reads series, as I have done for the last several years. So I want to thank you all so much for being with me this year for the Atheist Reads series, all 4 of them that I've done this year. Thanks to all of you who are watching these series for the first time this year, who didn't watch them in the past. I know that I have quite a few new viewers to these series this year, and I just want to say welcome and thank you for the support. And I hope you find the time or you have the interest to go back and watch some of the older shows, and I hope that you find something useful in them, and I hope that you found something useful in this one as well. If you enjoy this work that I do, if you have some benefit that you've gotten from it, please like this video, share it, subscribe to this channel if you're not subbed already, and also please consider helping me to make more videos like this one and to continue making YouTube videos in general by supporting this channel through Patreon. You can go to patreon.com/Steve Shives, and you can become a patron for as little as $1 a month, which really helps out. But if you can afford to give $5 a month, you get little extra perks. Like, for instance, you get a sneak peek at the scripts for Atheist Reads videos the day before the video goes up. And that also goes for Steve and Stuffy videos. I will be posting the screenplays for the Steve and Stuffy videos a day before the videos actually go live on YouTube for $5 pledges and higher. And for higher pledges than that, you can take advantage of some even more perks, some little rewards that I make available to show my appreciation for the support. So whether it's $1 a month, $5 a month, $10 a month, whatever you can afford, whatever you think I'm worth, please, please, please consider supporting this channel through Patreon. As always, please leave a comment on this video with your reaction to something I've had to say. If you agree, if you disagree, you think I got something right, you think I got something wrong. I'm very interested to hear what you have to say in response to what I have had to say in this video or in this series in general. I thank you so, so much as always for your attention and your support, and I'll see you next time.